Chapter 29 of Paul the Dauntless. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by David Leeson. Paul the Dauntless by Basil Joseph Mathews. Chapter 29. Away with him. The clatter of horses' hoofs on the flagged street called Paul and his friends out at dawn for the canter across the rolling plain and the climb among the hills of Samaria and Judea. Guided by some of the friends from Caesarea, they turned their faces to the rising sun and rode along the chariot way, passing the inns from whose courtyards the grumbling camels were striding out, and skirting the empty stadium, till the short tunnel of the gateway in the city wall led them out to the freshness of the open country. Through the day they travelled, climbing the hills, resting in the blazing summer noonday, and at sundown they came to the home of an old man who with glowing face welcomed the great leader Paul with his friends to his house. The old man's name was Mnason. He had been a disciple of Christ for long years, and like Barnabas, he was a native of Cyprus. Next morning they said farewell to Mnason and breasted the hills again, till at last, as the shadow began to fall across the brook Kidron, they came out under the walls of Jerusalem. Paul found himself again in the city where he had dreamed dreams as a student. He forgot even the enemies who plotted against his life, when he saw the faces of the brothers in Jerusalem light with joy as he came among them. He would be glad, too, to see his nephew, the son of his sister, who lived in Jerusalem. Going along the familiar streets on the following morning, Paul saw the harvest thanksgiving preparations, the little sheaves of corn, the huts of branches on the rooftops recalling the old days when the Jews, wandering across the desert from Egypt, had neither harvest nor house. He entered the doorway of a house where in a large room the elders of the church in Jerusalem had already come together, with the Lord's brother James presiding. Paul courteously saluted them. Then he began to tell much of the story that we have read in this book. Imagine the glory of hearing it at first hand from the man to whom these adventures had really come. Quiet, conventional, stay-at-home men as they were, the elders were transported to a new world as they leaned forward with parted lips, chin on hand, listening to this flaming torch of a man, Paul, who had sped over sea and plain, through mountain pass and robber valley, beaten and stoned and starved, slaving with his hands before dawn and declaring his glorious message till after midnight. Singing in prison, rejoicing at the hard knocks of the world, the quickener of life in a score of cities and across half the known world, the untiring Jewish traveller, the free brave Roman citizen, the blazing Greek orator, the glad slave of Christ. Then Timothy of Lystra and Gaius of Derbe came forward with their gift from the churches upon the plateau of Galatia, Tychicus and Trophimus of Ephesus with the gift from Asia, and Aristarchus and Secundus from Macedonia, with Sopater of Berea, handed in their offering. As Paul ceased speaking and the gifts were offered, the elders broke out into thanks. " Glory be to God," they cried, " for these wonderful works through his servant Paul." Then the glow of the wide vision faded, and Jerusalem was about them again and the church in Jerusalem, still in many of its members trying to cramp Christ within the iron hoop of a single nation's destiny. " Brother," they said to him, " you see how many thousands of believers there are among the Jews, all of them ardent upholders of the law. Now they have heard that you teach all Jews who live among the nations to break away from Moses and not to circumcise their children, nor to follow the old customs. What is to be done?" they went on. " They will be sure to hear you have arrived. So do as we tell you. We have 4 men here under a vow. Associate yourself with them. Purify yourself with them. Pay their expenses so that they may be free to have their heads shaved." These men had taken the Nazirite vow that they would not shave their heads till they had performed certain acts and purified themselves. " If you do that," said the elders to Paul, " everybody will understand that there is nothing in these stories about you, but that, on the contrary, you are yourself guided by reverence for the law. As for these believers among the nations, we have already sent out through you, in the letter signed by James, our decision that they must avoid food that has been offered on altars to idols, the taste of blood, flesh of animals that have been strangled, and unclean vice." Paul knew that the forms of ceremony in the temple were not the heart of worship of God. They were the ceremonies of one people. Yet with that all-embracing sweep of his passion for winning men, Paul consented to do as the elders suggested. On the very next day he began to carry out the act of purification for himself along with the 4 men. Paul went into the temple courts with the men. "I wish to join these men," he said, "and to pay their charges, till the vow is accomplished and till they can be freed from it." Day after day, and at Paul's expense, they each offered gifts of money and oil, a ram, a lamb, and cakes. On the 7th day they would have fulfilled all the ceremonies. But that 7th day never came for Paul. With crafty eyes his enemies watched him. They had seen him walking in the streets with Trophimus from Ephesus, to them a sinner of the Gentiles, a man without the law. They saw Paul go up the steps to the marble parapet where the great stone stood which said, "Let no foreigner enter within the screen and enclosure surrounding the sanctuary. Whoever is taken so doing will himself be the cause that death overtaketh him." Paul crossed the line and went through the opening. His bare feet were upon the marble of the Holy Court. The hour had come. The Jews from Asia were there, possibly some of those who had plotted his death 2 months earlier, when Paul was starting to sail from Corinth, and had been balked. They would not be foiled again. They dashed at him, gripped his mantle and raised a cry that thrilled the heart of Pharisee and Zealot alike. "To the rescue, men of Israel! Help! Help! Here is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against the chosen people, against the law of Moses, against this holy place! Help! Help!" To every quarter of the temple the cry rang out. Men dashed in from all sides to join in the defence. The cry rang across the roofs to the Roman castle by the temple, where the sentinel stood like a statue on the turret of Antony's tower. "He has brought Greeks inside the temple and defiled this holy place," cried the Jews from Asia. "To the rescue, men of Israel! Help!" Up the streets of the city the cry ran like wildfire. The Jews dashed into the temple, but they would not defile the sacred place by killing him there. "Out of the temple with him!" came the cry. Dragging, pushing, shouting, waving, the whole mob surged toward the gates and into the open place without. The gates of the temple enclosure swung to with a clang and were bolted. "Kill him! Kill him!" cried the fanatics, some of them the men who had cried before Pilate, as Jesus Christ stood on trial 30 years earlier, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" and had yelled, "Stone him! Stone him!" in the hour of Stephen's death. They lifted their sticks and began to beat him furiously over the head and shoulders and back. But the sentinel on Antony's tower had already taken action. He sent down word to the commander of the garrison regiment, who rapped out an order, and in a few minutes with officers and men was hurrying to the spot. Dashing aside the mob, the company marched to the centre. The cry, "The soldiers are coming!" was raised. The staves were dropped and silence fell. "Who is he?" asked the commander, Lysias. "What has he done?" Some of the crowd roared one thing, some another. He could not learn the facts for the uproar. "Chain him," ordered Lysias. 2 chains were clasped on his wrists. At that moment Paul left the world of freedom. He never moved for years to come without the sound of the clank of his fetters in his ear. "Lead him to the citadel," ordered Lysias. Along the front of the temple and out under the shadow of the Roman tower they moved, the Jewish mob raging and yelling behind and around. They thronged upon Paul, clutching at his robe till the soldiers had actually to carry him. "Away with him! Away with the fellow from the earth! Away with him!" At last the soldiers reached the steps of the citadel. They were about to lead Paul to the cells in the barracks when he turned to the commander. "May I say a word to you?" he asked Lysias, speaking in Greek. "You know Greek?" said the astonished commander. "Then you are not the Egyptian, who in days gone by raised the 4,000 assassins and led them out into the desert?" "I am a Jew," said Paul with quiet dignity, "a native of Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. Pray let me speak to the people." Paul, bound as he was and bruised, stood forward on the top of the steps before the mob and began to speak to them in Hebrew, their own tongue. Something in the presence of that undaunted figure, and in the sound of that vibrant voice which had won the hearing of men in many lands, swept over that seething mob. A deep hush came on them, like the whisper and the silence that come over a field of corn, as it sways to the breeze and then is still. " Brothers and fathers," he said, " listen to the defence I now make before you." When they heard him speaking in Hebrew they were all the more quiet. So he went on. " I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel in all the strictness of our ancestral law, ardent for God as you all are today. I persecuted this way of religion to the death, chaining and imprisoning both men and women, as the high priest and all the council of elders can testify. It was from them that I got letters to the brotherhood at Damascus, and then journeyed thither to bind those who had gathered there and bring them back to Jerusalem for punishment. Now, as I neared Damascus on my journey, suddenly about noon a brilliant light from heaven flashed round me. I dropped to the earth and heard a voice saying to me, ' Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' ' Who are you?' I asked. He said to me, ' I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting.' I said, ' What shall I do, Lord?' And the Lord said to me, ' Rise up and go into Damascus. There you shall be told about all that you are destined to do.' As I could not see owing to the dazzling glare of that light, my companions took my hand, and so I reached Damascus. Then a certain Ananias, a devout man in the law, who had a good reputation among all the Jews there, came to me and standing beside me said, ' Saul, my brother, regain your sight.' The crowd of Jews with uplifted faces listened in silence to the wonderful story. Paul went on. " The same moment I regained my sight and looked up at Ananias. Then he said, ' The God of our fathers has appointed you to know His will, to see the Just One, and to hear Him speak with His own lips. For you are to be a witness for Him before all men, a witness of what you have seen and heard. And now, why do you wait? Get up and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on His name.' When I returned to Jerusalem, it happened that while I was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw Him saying to me, ' Make haste, leave Jerusalem quickly, for they will not accept your evidence about me.' ' But Lord,' I said, ' they surely know that it was I who imprisoned and flogged those who believed in you throughout the synagogues, and that I stood and approved when the blood of your martyr Stephen was being shed, taking charge of the clothes of his murderers.' But He said to me, ' Go, I will send you afar to the nations.' " At that word the silence broke into a thunder of rage. That was the root of all Paul's offence, that he had gone with his message to the nations beyond. And now he dared to blaspheme by saying that God — the God whose chosen people the Jews were — had told him to do so, and had told him in the Holy Temple. " Away with such a creature from the earth," they yelled. " He is not fit to live." They tore off their clothes in a frenzy of angry grief, and like mourners grabbed the dust of the roadway and flung it into the air. Lysias was mystified. What made the Jews foam with such hysterical rage? They were too wild to tell him intelligibly. Paul must. " Take him into the barracks," said Lysias to his officers. " Examine him under the lash and report." They saluted and marched Paul away. They took him to the thrashing post and strapped him to it, so that he might not struggle. When he was thrashed and his spirit cowed, they would make him confess his crimes. Paul spoke to the officer who was standing by giving orders. " Are you allowed to scourge a Roman citizen?" he asked, " and to scourge him without trial?" The officer was aghast. Lysias, he knew, would be degraded from his rank, and severely punished if he beat a Roman citizen and word of it reached Rome. It was bad enough even to have bound him. He hurried to Lysias and said to him, " What are you going to do? This man is a Roman citizen." Lysias rose at once and went out to where Paul stood strapped to the post. " Tell me," he said, " are you a Roman citizen? "" Yes," replied Paul. " I had to pay a large sum of money to buy my citizenship," said the wondering commander. " But I was born a citizen," replied Paul with pride. He was loosed from his bonds at once and led away. In that hour the three threads of Paul's life — The Jewish, Greek, and Roman had all stood him in good stead: the Greek when he spoke to Lysias, the Jewish when he quelled the uproar, the Roman when he was bound. Paul lay down to sleep that night a prisoner, yet freer than all the hide-bound fanatics who had tried to take his life. But Lysias was still puzzled as to what Paul had done to infuriate the Jews. The next morning, therefore, he sent an order down to the temple that the high priests and the Sanhedrin, the highest authority in the Jewish world, should come and meet with Paul. Lysias, when the Sanhedrin had come together, brought Paul down and placed him in front of them. Paul looked at them with a steady gaze, entirely fearless of their anger. " Brothers," he said, " I have lived with a perfectly good conscience before God down to this present day." It was too much. Ananias, the high priest, purple with rage, shouted to those near Paul. " Smite him," he cried. " Strike him on the mouth." Paul lost his temper, and swinging round toward the white-robed Ananias, he burst out, " You whitewashed wall, God will strike you. You sit there to judge me by the law, do you? And you break the law by ordering me to be struck." " What," said some of the bystanders to Paul, " would you rail at God's high priest?" " Brothers," said Paul, " I did not know that he was high priest." At this point Paul, realizing that the Sanhedrin was made up as to one half of Sadducees who did not believe in the resurrection of man, and as to the other of Pharisees who did believe in the resurrection, shouted to them, " I am a Pharisee, brothers, the son of Pharisees. It is for the hope of the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial." At once a quarrel broke out. Lysias could make no sense of all this wrangling and clamour, the Sadducees urging Paul's death, the Pharisees forgetting in their defence of their own teaching their hatred of Paul. Scribes of the Pharisees rose up, and the court listened. " We find nothing wrong about this man," said the Pharisaic scribes. " What if some spirit or angel has spoken to him? " The uproar redoubled. The Sadducees stood and shouted and pressed toward Paul as though to tear him to pieces. Lysias ordered the troops to be brought from the citadel, and they formed a bodyguard to protect Paul. The soldiers took him, driving the maddened Jews back, and led him into the barracks. But Lysias was no wiser as to the cause of all the uproar. Paul, as he lay that night with all the future black before him, was conscious of the real presence of his Lord by him. " Courage," said the Presence, " as you have testified to me at Jerusalem, so you must do at Rome." The Jews who saw their archenemy Paul snatched from under their very hand by the Roman power were determined that, even now, he should not escape. Between 40 and 50 of them came together at dawn on the next day in secret. They formed a plot for an ambuscade. Standing together, they took a most solemn oath that they would not taste food till they had killed Paul. They went, then, down to the temple, and gained audience with the high priests and elders. " We have," they said, " taken a solemn oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now, you and the Sanhedrin must let the commander know that you propose to investigate this case in detail, so that he may have Paul brought down to you. We will be all ready and will kill him on the way down." A young man overheard men talking about the plot. He was Paul's nephew. He hurried up to the citadel, got entrance to the barracks, and was allowed to see Paul, to whom he told the whole story. Paul called to one of the officers. " Take this young man," he said, " to the commander, for he has some news to give him." So the officer led Paul's nephew to Lysias. " The prisoner Paul," he said, " has summoned me to ask if I would bring this young man to you, as he has something to tell you." The commander took Paul's nephew by the hand and led him aside and asked him in private, " What is the news you have for me? " "The Jews have agreed," he answered, "to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the Sanhedrin, on the plea that they propose to examine his case in detail. Now, do not let them persuade you. More than 40 of them are lying in ambush for him, and they have taken a solemn oath neither to eat nor to drink till they have murdered him. They are already at this moment awaiting your consent." Lysias paused to think, then he dismissed the youth. His mind was swiftly made up. He knew the anger of Rome if a Roman citizen, even a prisoner, suffered death by murder when in the charge of a Roman official. " Tell nobody," he said, " that you have informed me of this." As Paul's nephew went out, Lysias called to 2 officers, who stood before him awaiting orders. " Get ready by 8 o'clock tonight 200 infantry, with rations, to march as far as Caesarea. Also 70 troopers and 200 spearmen." Chapter 29